Welcome to our last lecture in this fantastic lecture series of the summer semester 2025. The last lecture will be held by Anke Graness, and she is within the German philosophy the first professor for philosophies in Africa since last year, October, I think, or September, October. So this was somehow already a turning point in philosophy also in Germany, that we now have this field established in the order of knowledge in philosophy in Germany, at least in Germany. We are, of course, collaborating with Alena Retova in Bayreuth, who is a professor for Afrophone philosophies, but within the African Studies department. And I think it makes a difference that we include the philosophies of Africa within the philosophy department, and this happened last year. Anke Graness did her PhD at the University of Vienna, which used to be a very important place for intercultural philosophy several years ago. And then she came to Hildesheim and was the managing director of the COSELEC project, Histories of Philosophy in Global Perspectives. And our project now, Philosophizing in the Globalized World, is the follow-up of this project. And now she is responsible for the first 2 years in this project for the focus on African philosophies. And I think you did a great job already the last year, and also organizing together with Claudia, with Monika Roma, organizing this fantastic lecture series. And I'm looking forward to your presentation, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Rolf, for this kind introduction. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here today and to be able to do the last lecture of our series. And this is what I would like to do today. I would like to talk a little bit about the past of this issue, philosophizing in African languages, past positions and discourses. I would also like to share with you a little bit my impression about the present situation of this topic, and I would like also to give some ideas how to proceed or what could be done in the future concerning the debate about philosophizing in African languages. But first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the experts who participated in our lecture series, Philosophizing in African Languages, and who contributed to its great success with their excellent lectures. The lectures and the subsequent research talks were invaluable for our own research project here in Hildesheim. We learned so much, so my thanks and my gratitude goes to all who participated in this series. But the effect goes beyond our frame here in Hildesheim, because the lectures were not only of great interest for us, but also to a wider audience, as the number of views of all recorded lectures shows. Some of the lectures have views of 1,000 and more people, or have more than 1,000 views. In my introductory words now here, I would also like to link to this UNESCO initiative. I think the lecture series has attracted so much interest is also encouraging in the light of this resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, which declared the period between 2022 and 2032 the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, with the aim of drawing global attention to the critical situation of many indigenous languages and with the aim of mobilizing actors and resources for their preservation and promotion. I am convinced that our lecture series fits well in this goal of the United Nations. And so I think the relevance of our focus on philosophizing in very many different languages, among them, of course, African languages, goes beyond the specific concern of our discipline of philosophy. It really has a much wider social relevance. And even if it is unlikely that our efforts can save a language from extinction, nevertheless, philosophy can provide arguments for the necessity of preserving linguistic diversity. One main book which very much inspired us also to do this or to form and organize this lecture series was the anthology Listening to Ourselves by the Canadian, edited by the Canadian Caribbean philosopher Chike Jeffers. Unfortunately, Chike Jeffers, whom we invited to come to Hildesheim, was not able to come, and for this reason, it's now today me giving the final lecture in our series today, in which I will attempt to summarize some positions on philosophizing in African languages and to offer some prospects for the future. Of course, I can only view this from the perspective of an outsider, as an observer of philosophical debates in Africa, who is positioned in the Academy of the Global North, which may naturally limit my access to and my understanding of this topic. Let me begin my talk now with a reference to this anthology, Listening to Ourselves, for which Jeffers asked well-known African philosophers to write contributions in their native languages, in their native African languages, for example, in Doluo, Gikuyu, Akan, Igbo, Wolof, or Amharic, which were then published bilingually, also in an English translation. Some of the authors with whom I spoke admitted that this had been one of the most difficult tasks in their philosophical careers, namely writing a philosophical text in their mother tongue. The contribution of the late Nigerian philosopher Emmanuel Eze, written in his native language Igbo under the title Word and Mind, starts with a short parable. And the parable goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a turtle that collected all his knowledge, kept it to himself, and did not want to share with anyone. The turtle put the knowledge he had collected in a bag, tied it around his neck, and tried to climb the highest tree to hide the bag out of the reach of anyone else. But the turtle didn't get far, as the bag prevented him from climbing. A bird, seeing this, laughed at him and advised the turtle to tie the bag to his back and then climb up. The turtle followed their advice and finally made some progress. However, the turtle realized that the bird obviously had knowledge that did not belong to him. Annoyed at not being in sole possession of all knowledge, the turtle threw the bag from the tree. The bag burst and the wind spread the knowledge around the world. Emmanuel Eze goes on to argue that just as the turtle cannot possess all knowledge in the world, one single language alone is not capable of expressing all truths. Rather, it is important to analyze the richness of all languages. And what concerns the amount of languages, Africa is so rich. Africa, it is said by some linguists, is the home of about 2,100 indigenous languages. Others even estimate over 3,000 languages. Often not included in this count are European languages which are not indigenous to Africa, but as a result of colonialism widely spoken, namely English, French, and Portuguese, and to a very small extent also Spanish. The linguistic diversity of Africa is, without any doubts, a challenge, but also an opportunity also for philosophy. And so it is not astonishing that debates about philosophizing in African languages and about the possibilities and limits of translatability of philosophical concepts, as well as about the appropriate language in which an African philosopher should philosophize, occupy a central place in African academic philosophy since more than 50 years. From a philosophical point of view, it is not surprising that these debates took up so much space. Language is the preferred tool of our discipline, philosophy. While there may be other means of expressing philosophical ideas, language is undoubtedly the most widely used tool. Furthermore, language is a central theme in philosophy, a central topic. For example, the connection between language and thought, or how to access the world, how to shape our world, how to do our relationship to the world and to other human beings. All this relates to the issue of language. And so in the humanities, the question of language in which one thinks, as well as publishes and teaches, is of particular importance. And I just want to remind on the lecture of Rolf Elberfeld in our series, where he explored this topic of the plurality of languages, the importance of the plurality of languages for philosophy in more depth. However, in the African context, it is not only the richness of great diversity of languages that gives cause to reflect on the importance of indigenous languages in philosophy. It is the legacy of colonialism in particular that has made the language question in Africa of such an importance and as well a highly political issue that is also the subject of a heated debate in academic philosophy in Africa. So colonial and racist prejudice not only led to an image of Africa that was predominantly associated with oral societies, but the long written traditions on this continent were also considered unworthy of any philosophical analysis. The possibility that ancient Egyptian manuscripts and inscriptions already dealt with philosophical questions was rejected for a long time, and the origin of philosophy was localized in ancient Greece alone. Philosophy in Arabic only seemed to exist up to the northern edge of the Sahara. Ajami texts were hardly being subjected to philosophical analysis. The same applies to Swahili, the Swahili area in East Africa, where studies under a philosophical perspective are just at the beginning. Texts in Ethiopian Gesh, as we learned last week, have so far mainly been analyzed under a theological and liturgical, perhaps also literary aspect, and were only introduced into the philosophical discourse in the 1970s by Claude Sumner. Some of the lectures in recent weeks documented very well today's endeavors to close the gap in this research. I would just like to remind you of the lectures of Kai Kresse, Usman Khan, Monica Roma, Amre El Havari, and of course Fasil Meravi and Jonathan Egid, who are still here with us today. If African written traditions have had and continue to have difficulties in being recognized as sources of philosophy, this is even more true for oral traditions, since philosophy is often understood in the prevailing discourse as being bound to writing. A very broad debate has arisen on the question of philosophy and oral traditions, and which I will not go into further here today. Instead, I would like to take a closer look at the impact of colonial language policies, to which many of the problems of contemporary philosophy in Africa and also, of course, in other regions of the world can be traced. As we all know, colonization does not only mean the military and political subjugation and economic exploitation of a territory, but it was also connected by, or is accompanied by the imposition of the language of the so-called mother country as the official language and as the language of the formal education system, both as a central instrument for the management and control of the colonized societies, albeit to varying degrees, depending on different ideologies and administrative strategies. So, for example, one usually makes a distinction between the British and the French colonial rule. The British is called the indirect rule, where local power structures and also languages were partially retained for administration, especially at lower levels, and the Francophone, the French colonial policy, is called the policy of direct rules. That means that particularly the French language and culture were very much promoted and also seen as the only legitimate medium in administration, education, and in the public life. These different colonial language policies seem to have had an impact on philosophy to this day, as shown by, for example, the different differences in the discourse, in the philosophical discourse in Anglophone and Francophone academia. My impression, also after many encounters with colleagues from Africa in recent months, is that in the English-speaking African countries, the idea of philosophizing in African languages is maybe more alive or deeper rooted than in French-speaking countries, where these ideas seem to be less widespread and where some colleagues were rather surprised by our research interest in philosophizing in African languages. But perhaps I am mistaken and my observation is incorrect, but maybe we can discuss this point later in the question and answer session. Another point going along with this kind of language policy, colonial language policy, is that colonial policies established also a hierarchy in which the colonial language was regarded as superior and associated with power, education, and social mobility, while local languages were stigmatized as inferior, unsuitable for official or higher functions, and of course also unsuited for philosophy. For African languages were regarded as primitive, barbaric, not capable to host abstract thinking, and also not to be able for hosting literature, science, or philosophy. In consequence, the language of instruction in schools, particularly of higher education, had to be a colonial language such as English, French, or Portuguese. Authors like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and many other African writers and philosophers witness in their works that it was forbidden at school to speak native languages. Children were ridiculed or punished if they did. That it was forbidden until recently, and maybe in certain parts or in certain regions of Africa might be still forbidden, was also witnessed by some of our guests of our lecture series who reported in our research talks about posters at their schools saying, "Speak English, do not speak vernacular." I was, by the way, very much astonished, or I found it a very interesting fact that obviously in Ethiopia, the choice of English as the language of instruction in formal educational systems was a decision of the Ethiopians. Yeah. It was not imposed by colonialism. So we also see differences, of course, in the different regions and countries of Africa. So the effects of colonial language policies were also devastating for the history of philosophy in Africa, not least because colonial formal education systems and the imposition of colonial languages interrupted the intergenerational transmission of indigenous philosophical vocabularies and schools, theories, and discursive practices, and as well as maybe further practices of philosophizing. Now, given the instrumentalization of languages in colonization as a means of control and exclusion, and not at least as a means of stabilization of colonial power, it is hardly surprising that liberation from the language of the colonial ruler was soon seen as an essential aspect of the decolonization processes. This process may have begun earlier, but I think the so-called Great Nairobi Literature Debate in 1968 was one of the very important points in the African history, which was so important for the development, the further development of the humanities in Africa. In 1968, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Henry Owour Anyumba and Tabanyo Leong authored the Manifesto on the Abolition of the English Department. Their central argument was that the study of literature at African universities should not be focused on English literature, but rather on African literature and literary traditions, with English and other European literatures becoming part of a broader comparative curriculum. The manifesto sparked a broad debate on literary, cultural, and educational policy in Kenya and in other African countries, which aimed to fundamentally redefine what the content of the curricula in post-colonial African countries should include and which priorities should be set here. From the question of the curriculum, it was only a small step to also putting the dominant language of instruction, the language of science and literature, into question. And consequently, Ngugi wa Thiong'o began writing his plays and books in his mother tongue, Gikuyu, in the 1970s. This turning away from English and towards the African mother tongue, which Ngugi often addressed and justified in his political and cultural essays, led to a deepening of the debate on the need of intellectual emancipation from Western epistemes, as well as the debates on the pros and cons of writing in African languages. Now, many of you might know the point of view of Ngugi, but some of our listeners maybe not. So I would like just shortly to describe his position. Ngugi wa Thiong'o's approach centers on the cultural emancipation of Africans as part of a broader liberation process that only began with political independence. Education as well as cultural and literary production must integrate more content from Africa's heritage and also present, and he here emphasizes also the importance of oral traditions so that the world can be viewed from an African perspective. Language is an important aspect of this. For Ngugi, the predominant use of former colonial languages to this day symbolizes the persistence of neo-colonial oppression. The choice of language is evidence of dependence on Europe and the adoption of Eurocentric points of view, argues Ngugi wa Thiong'o. This is because languages convey concepts and ideas that fundamentally determine the respective view of the world. In addition, the neglect of African languages leads to their impoverishment. Only the use of the language, not only in everyday life, but also in the production of literature, science, and philosophy, can keep it alive and develop it further. But Ngugi wa Thiong'o had also precursors. So first of all, writing in African languages did, of course, not just stop automatically with colonization. For example, Ajami writing continued to be used. Literature in Swahili was produced, in Gesh it was continued to be produced. And as for example, the philosopher Albert Cassander in his research shows, also texts on the need of a decolonization were already produced in the 1960s in African languages before the Great Nairobi debate. He discussed in the last winter semester in one of his lectures here a text written in Chiluba in 1967 which addressed the need for decolonization in Chiluba. And Chantal Guichoma, she showed in her lecture that a text by Alexis Kagame in his mother tongue, Kinyarwanda, which also contains a critique of colonialism, was published in 1949. So, I mean, there was a continuous also production of texts in African languages. So this is one thing. And the other thing is, and these are maybe also famous examples here of precursors of Ngugi. Famous is, of course, Cheikh Anta Diop, who translated Einstein's theory of relativity, or at least parts of this theory of relativity, into Wolof already in the 1950s, namely in order to demonstrate the ability of African languages to formulate abstract scientific knowledge. And maybe also in the same line of arguments, the Ghanaian philosopher, or he was a classical philologist, Lawrence Henry Ofusu-Appiah, he translated Plato's Apology of Socrates into Akan Twi in 1976, or even earlier in 1962, Homer's Odyssey. He also translated it into Akan. So I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o's approach to decolonization or the emancipation of Africans, and here the importance of languages, goes still one step further. For Ngugi, the question of the use of African languages is namely also a class issue. As the official languages of the country are often insufficiently spoken by some of the rural population, those including them from meaningful participation in the public life, in political life, and in shaping the country. In this respect, his fight for the recognition of African languages and the African intellectual heritage, which is alive above all in oral traditions, as Ngugi argues, is for him also a fight for more social justice and against the domination of imperialism worldwide. And I think this becomes very clear in this quote here, where he says, "Writers in African languages should reconnect themselves to the revolutionary traditions of an organized peasantry and working class in Africa in their struggle to defeat imperialism and create a higher system of democracy and socialism in alliance with all other people in the world." Now, since Ngugi, debates about the importance of using African languages for philosophizing have not finished, and one of the most prominent African philosophers who has devoted himself to these questions is undoubtedly the late Ghanaian philosopher Kwasi Wiredu. Richmond Kwesi reminded us in his lecture of the great work of Wiredu. Wiredu's approach can be best described as a linguistic analytical perspective on the decolonization of the mind, or conceptual decolonization, as he coined this term. In contrast to Ngugi's approach, which I call the liberation theory perspective, this explicitly philosophical approach does not have a decidedly socio-political goal. The central concern is a conceptual decolonization in the sense of a liberation from the all-pervasive Western thought structures, which obscure the view of the structures belonging to African perspectives. In his analysis, Wiredu shows that the usually unconscious adoption of the forms of thought specific to a particular language often leads to distortions and falsifications of meaning in the process of translating African concepts into European languages. So using terms like truth, like being, like many other philosophical categories like person, Viredu has analyzed their philosophical content in his mother tongue, Akan Twi, and examined the extent to which a translation of these terms into English or vice versa leads to a shift in meaning. I think one of the most well-known examinations of him is, of course, the one of Descartes' cogito ergo sum, where he shows that the cogito ergo sum and this distinction between mind and body cannot be expressed in the Akan language as it is done in, for example, Latin or in French. So due to the clear semantic differences, colonial languages should not be adopted unchecked for philosophical work is the position of Kwasi Viredu. Rather, an unreflected adoption is for him a sign of, as he calls it, colonial mentality. Now, for him, conceptual decolonization means subjecting the Western languages, values, institutions, etc., imposed or uncritically adopted by colonialism and neocolonialism to a fundamental critique and examining whether indigenous languages, values, and institutions cannot also be used to shape the present or even offer more adequate solutions, so African solutions for African problems. Conceptual decolonization consists of a double gesture, in his opinion, and this is maybe the central quote from his very important article on these issues, namely the need for conceptual decolonization, which you can find in his book, Cultural Universals and Particulars, and which I can only recommend to read. On the one hand, conceptual decolonization means avoiding an uncritical assimilation of the conceptual system embedded in foreign philosophical traditions. On the other hand, it means exploiting one's own resources for all philosophical problems. Instead of uncritically adopting terms and concepts that have been internalized through the medium of the language of the metropolises, it is important to think through concepts in one's own languages, or as he says here, try to think them through, the concepts in your own African language, and on the basis of these results, review the intelligibility of the associated problems or the plausibility of the apparent solutions that have tempted you when you have pondered them in some metropolitan languages. Viredu considers such an approach to be a method that is not only important for African philosophers. Rather, it is a method that is of general importance, especially with regard to intercultural philosophizing. As a third perspective, just let me mention a gender perspective. So before I move to the present situation, I would like to touch briefly, at least, the gender perspective on this topic, on the significance of philosophizing in African languages, the gender perspective which may not have been adequately addressed during our lecture series in the last weeks. I would like to refer here to the important analysis of Oyeronke Oyewumi in her book, The Invention of Woman, in which the author not only questions whether the analytical category gender is universally applicable, but also shows that or how the translation of categories and names from the pantheon and the history and culture of the Yoruba into English, due to the Western ethnological perspective, which is accompanied by Western ideas of gender roles, has led to a masculinization and patriarchalization of Yoruba history and religion. And one of the central sentences in her book is, the creation of woman as a category was one of the first accomplishments of the colonial state, meaning that the idea or the introduction of the idea of woman, which is connected, of course, in the European sense with certain images or ideas about gender roles, was introduced into the Yoruba society only with colonialism. Let us move to the present. So far, some positions from the discourse on philosophizing in African languages. There are many more positions and also papers on this issue which were produced during the last decades, but I just selected 3 positions here now to illustrate the debates of the past decades. Let us come to the present. In his foreword to the anthology, Listening to Ourselves, which was published in 2013, Ngugi wa Thiong'o describes this book, this anthology, from which also the parable of the turtle was quoted at the beginning. He describes this book as a historical intervention in the debates on African philosophy. And he expresses his hope that this volume will contribute to a change in the tradition of written African philosophy, as he considers African philosophy in European languages, and this is really a quote, to be absurd. He calls for the linguistic identity of African philosophy to be restored by writing in African languages. For him, philosophizing in African languages is the only way in which Africa can make an original contribution to human knowledge, and the key to the development of new living traditions of African literature and philosophy. Well, now we are in 2025, and we have to state that Ngugi's vision did not become true until today. Not only that not all African philosophers and intellectuals might share Ngugi's rather radical position. But until today, in Africa, south of the Sahara, literature and academic philosophy continue to be written mainly in English, French, and Portuguese. So the wonderful collection of G.K. Jeffers didn't change the discourse, actually. Explorations on different philosophical heritages in oral or written African languages are, until now, done in the former colonial languages. And this concerns actually all schools of African philosophy, as they were differentiated, for example, by Odera Oruka. It concerns the so-called school of ethnophilosophy. It concerns the Negritude. And it is also a fact that the broad discourse on Ubuntu, as it was introduced in our lecture series by Professor Ramosi, is done mainly in English. Discourses on Yoruba philosophy, Abusede presented, introduced into Yoruba philosophy, are mainly done in English. And also Richmond Kwesi's introduction into Akan philosophy was done in English, and this was not only for the purpose of this lecture series, but in general, these discourses are done in English or to a certain degree in French. And here we are at the crucial point. The project of a decolonization of the mind, or conceptual decolonization by using African languages, offers opportunities, but also poses, obviously, many, many problems. Let me start with the opportunities. It's very roughly summarizing here. The opportunities, of course, lie above all in drawing on the wealth of philosophical ideas in African languages and the history of African peoples, and in opening up worldviews and concepts that have previously not played a role in philosophical debates. And we should not forget that knowledge can come from unexpected resources, like the bird in our turtle story, who had knowledge which the turtle didn't have. In his article, by the way, Emmanuel Eze makes, I think, very important distinction. Namely, he differentiates between philosophizing in the Igbo language and Igbo philosophy. Discussing philosophy in the Igbo language requires extensive language skills in this language. But philosophy in Igbo language does not necessarily have to reflect only on Igbo philosophy derived from the Igbo culture, but can, of course, tackle any problem of this world. On the other hand, one can also think and write about Igbo philosophy without mastering the language, what has widely been done if we maybe think also about certain concepts from the ethnophilosophy school, like Bantu philosophy. Not all were fluent in Bantu languages who wrote about Bantu philosophy. Eze considers now the ability to do philosophy in Igbo language to be an extraordinary, important, if not decisive, contribution to the decolonization of mind, because it not only makes it possible to think through European philosophical questions and concepts in African languages and examine their relevance and coherence, but also it makes an important contribution to the further development of indigenous languages. And here I think we see that Eze is very much in line also with the ideas of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So, but let us turn to the challenges. The problems associated with the call to philosophize in African languages are enormous, as writing in African languages faces no small challenges. These range from the challenges of multilingual nations to the lack of publication opportunities and the readership as a consequence of maybe also this multilingualism. With few exceptions, mainly the Northern African countries and Somalia, where there's only language Somali spoken, most African countries are multilingual. Ghana, 46 languages, I think, Kenya, 43, and as we know, Nigeria, it's estimated to have about 500 different languages. This means that even colleagues from the same philosophy department may not be able to understand a text written by another colleague in another indigenous African language as they do not speak or know this language. On the other side, many other native speakers of the language written in a certain, or the text written in a certain language might lack the interest or the education to read academic philosophical texts. And this raises the problem of the perception of philosophy in African languages, as well as the question of the possibility of intellectual exchange across language barriers. And these are problems that Kwasi Wiredu also addressed. When asked in an interview with Kai Kresse why, despite his explicit call to philosophize more in African languages, he himself had not begun to publish in his mother tongue, Wiredu replied the following. He said, "I'm afraid that I'm not as eminent as Ngugi. If I wrote my texts in Akan, I don't think anyone would translate them. Apart from that, Ghana alone has 46 languages. It would be a big problem if I taught in Akan at the University of Legon in Ghana. Even if Ghana had only one language, how would I communicate with Budunrin in Nigeria or Odera Uruka in Kenya? It's just not practical for us to work in our own languages at this time." So, of course, the choice of the language of instruction, as well as the need for international exchange, are compelling arguments for an academic lingua franca. Let us briefly have a look here to the problem of Portuguese-speaking Africa. Here, the reception is almost, in my opinion, exclusively one-sided on the part of the colleagues from Mozambique, Angola, Cabo Verde, or Guinea-Bissau, who are informed about the discourse in the Anglophone and Francophone parts of Africa, but whose own works, published in Portuguese, are hardly recognized. The discourse in Portuguese-speaking Africa seems to me to be a very closed one, in which there is a lively and interesting exchange with Brazil and the Afro-Brazilian diaspora, but otherwise little exchange with other colleagues in Africa, which is, I think, due to the language barrier. Okay, but back to the issue of philosophizing in indigenous African languages. In academic philosophy, Afrophone philosophical discourses are hardly noticed and are often only part of the knowledge of a very small community of experts. By drawing attention to the difficulties of philosophizing in African languages, Viredu implicitly points out that the central challenge for philosophizing in African languages lies less in the will of the individual philosopher, and certainly not in the suitability of African languages for formulating philosophical problems, but rather in translation. And here I can only agree with what Jonathan said last week. We need translation, translation, translation. So the basic prerequisite for engaging with different traditions of thought, concepts, ideas, and debates from other regions of the world is linguistic access, and this means translation into a language that is spoken by many. Ultimately, this means that the call to philosophize in African languages must go hand in hand with the development of an appropriate infrastructure that enables an intensive intellectual exchange within the continent and beyond. And this includes the availability of trained translators, budgets for translations, and corresponding publication organs whose dissemination goes beyond the narrow circle of native speakers. So implementation, therefore, requires the provision of fundamental material and financial resources. So, but there are further challenges. One of the further challenges, or another challenge, is, of course, the increasing dominions of English as a worldwide spoken academic language. And this can also be, by the way, documented in African journals on philosophy. So 30 years ago, in journals like Quest or Second Order, it was still common to publish papers in French and in English, so at least in two languages. And this is not anymore done. So English starts or becomes more and more the common language, the common academic language, and also in such journals, the language diversity is reduced. But in our talks with many colleagues during the last months, we also noticed an ambivalent attitude towards philosophizing in African languages, because, and one of the main arguments for the use of English, French, or Portuguese, besides the already mentioned arguments of multilingual context and internationalization, was that these languages contribute today to the unification of the multi-ethnic, multilingual countries. This is indeed an important argument, given the multi-ethnic states that most African countries are today, and given their difficult history as a product of colonial political decisions. On the other hand, this argument reminds us on the 19th century European idea, one nation, one people, one language. And an idea actually that was also quite problematic in the European context, and which also here in Europe led to the marginalization of many smaller languages. Further arguments which we were confronted with is that many Africans consider as their academic language of choice English, French, or Portuguese. And another point is that today it is already a fact that one or maybe more generations of Africans who grew up speaking English, French, or Portuguese as their mother tongue have these languages as a mother tongue and don't know any African language anymore. This concerns, of course, particularly a global, international, political, or economic elite. But in this respect, it is, of course, also correct to recognize English, French, and Portuguese as African languages today. Of course, we have to ask the question, what does this mean now for a conceptual or decolonization or the decolonization of the mind? I think these are difficult questions which also have to be addressed. And I think what also has to be addressed and has not yet been addressed in the discourses on philosophizing in African languages are new findings from the linguists. Here, recent research on the status of languages in Africa shows that colonial languages are no longer the main reasons for the marginalization of languages, but rather two other factors. And here I quote from the UNESCO Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger, where it is said in the chapter on Africa, in general, English and French, the ex-colonial languages for most of the continent, are not displacing African languages, at least not at this point in time. It is African languages that are replacing other African languages. So, for example, the examples given in this atlas is Swahili threatens more than 130 Tanzanian languages, or Setswana does the same to about 30 languages spoken in Botswana. And another very important point, which is rarely discussed in this broad discourse on how to philosophize, in which languages should we philosophize, which was maybe or only touched maybe by Ngugi, is that poverty and marginalization are also reasons for giving up one's language, for raising children in another language than their own in order to achieve better opportunities, to achieve economic advantages or to overcome discrimination. So I think these observations should also perhaps be taken into account in debates about philosophizing in African languages, questions of decolonization, and maybe to reflect more about these new developments could also help us to ask new questions, give new answers, or open also new perspectives. Now, in philosophy, I would summarize the current state of research as follows. First, with regard to oral traditions mainly, the main focus is on applying the method proposed by Viredu, namely to analyze concepts from European philosophy in comparison with concepts from African languages, or to examine core concepts from African languages in their philosophical dimension. However, these analyses are carried out in European languages, and this applies, as I said before already, to the ethnophilosophy, negritude, Ubuntu discourse. It applies also to the so-called conversational school of philosophy in Nigeria, on debates on African proverbs as a source of philosophy, etc. All this is done in European languages. Second, philosophical research into written African traditions is still in its infancy, but a growing body of work is emerging, for example, on philosophy in ancient Egypt, philosophy in the Swahili tradition, works on Gesh, as we heard, Arabic, Ajami, and Wolof, as it was documented also in our lecture series. And maybe one can summarize the situation as such, namely research into Afrophone philosophies is still actually in its beginnings, but I think it could gain more importance in the near future. And for the future, I have the following ideas. First of all, maybe a short comment, namely on the philosophy, the broad future of philosophy. So looking at the development of philosophical discourse in Africa over the past 30 years, there is cause for concern that in another 30 years, academic discourse will be conducted exclusively in English. But this is a global problem because the entire academic world maybe apart from Asia, where Chinese is very common as a language of science also, is confronted with the challenges of philosophizing in English. So also all German philosophers, if you want to work internationally, if you want to make an academic career, we also have to publish in English. So it's not just a threat for African languages. And yet, isn't it necessary to have a common language of communication if we want to philosophize together in a globalized world? In some debates, it sometimes seems as if we are faced with a choice between standardizing all thoughts and knowledge in one language in order to be able to communicate internationally and thereby then sacrificing linguistic diversity, or to preserve linguistic and epistemological diversity and giving up the possibility of international communication and understanding. This dichotomy or this choice is sometimes also reflected in papers on this issue of philosophizing in African languages. But I believe it is wrong to reduce the complex question to an either-or choice, because there's also the possibility of both and. And in our case, this would mean the coexistence of one or a certain number of international academic languages that enables us to exchange or to engage in a broad exchange and the preservation of linguistic plurality. But, of course, now this brings us back to the question of translation. So steps towards recognizing philosophy in African languages in the history and today, and promoting such philosophizing today could, I think, maybe include the following 3 steps or ideas, which I would finally here at the end introduce to you. Namely, the first point is close to what Chantal introduced to us, or what we learned in the lecture by Chantal Guichoma about Alexis Kagame. He used different languages for different purposes. While writing his books on Bantu philosophy, which were mainly addressed to an international audience in French, he also wrote texts in his mother tongue in Kinyarwanda in order to educate the people or to formulate his critique on the colonial system in a language which his compatriots could understand. I think this is very much in line what Ngugi wants, who sees writing in African languages as a contribution to the liberation of African workers and farmers who were excluded from discourses in English, French, or Portuguese. So in my opinion, what Kagame did, what Ngugi wants, can be also taken as a call to write philosophical books, essays, or short stories in African languages, namely also as a contribution to what is now called public philosophy. This is a term I prefer instead of pop philosophy. A subfield of philosophy that involves engagement with the public in the best Socratian sense, but not only Socrates did it, but also Orunmila in the Yoruba tradition, the founder of the Ifa corpus, who was actually also a public intellectual who engaged with the people and shared his knowledge with the people. A philosophy that uses its tools and techniques to help people answer the burning questions of today, questions about life and death, war and peace, justice and good governance, and a balanced relationship between humans and nature. And here is writing only one of the tools which could be used. There are, of course, quite a number of different tools which could be used, like podcasts, TV programs, debating clubs, and, of course, the internet or social media. Now, since, as the linguists say, or the new research shows, since Swahili in Tanzania, Setswana in Botswana, Zango in Central African Republic, Wolof in Senegal, Bambara in Mali, Kinyarwanda in Rwanda, or Amharic in Ethiopia, to list but a few, are among the African languages that have developed into media of nationwide communication. There are obviously a whole range of African languages that can be used to reach many people when philosophizing in African languages, for example, in the form of public philosophy or philosophizing with children. And I was very happy to hear in the morning in our research talk with Jonathan that there's already a big project of translating Gesh manuscripts into Amharic. So most of quite a big part of translation is done into Amharic. So in another African languages, what is of course, I think, very promising. Second, of course, translation again. So more investment is needed in translation work and a good infrastructure for translation. And here I think philosophical works from all over the world could, of course, be translated into African languages, but I think also particularly African authors should be translated into African languages. So for example, what was written in English or French by authors like Biredu, Huntonji, Oluvole, or Oruka, and here's an example from Oruka's Sage Philosophy, should be translated into English. And this, I think, is a very interesting case because Odera Oruka collected the knowledge or did interviews with his colleagues, with sages in different villages in Kenya in their mother tongue, and later it was transcribed and then translated in English and published in English. So all people who know English have now access to the wealth of knowledge of these Kenyan sages. And I think, for example, what Stephen Kitanye has to tell about what wisdom is and what is preventing us from wisdom is a wonderful thought which should be shared more, but it is not accessible for the people of his native language, Meru, in Kenya now, because it's only published in English, but not in the native language of this sage. So a retranslation maybe also of the Sage Philosophy project, or what I also thought of the explorations of the analysis of the Ifa corpus and the comparison between Orunmila and Socrates by Oluvole. Maybe it should also be published in Yoruba, yeah, because only English readers can read this. So there's a lot of possibilities, of course, where translation would make sense, I think. Yeah, and my last point is, of course, making philosophy in African languages more visible is also a very important step, also to initiate new research projects. And this is, of course, the goal of our research project here in Hildesheim, where we want to publish a database of key sources and works in very many languages, among them also a number of African languages, to highlight the richness of the heritage, to provide also material for further research, and also offer inspirations for the future of philosophy in African languages. Yeah, so I hope also our lecture series contributed there a little bit to this goal already, and in so far I would like to end with thanking again all those who contributed to our lecture series, who provided us with a lot of new material, who made this lecture series a success. And yeah, I'm looking forward for further cooperations and more research into this very interesting topic. And for now, I'm looking forward for your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anke. And now the floor is open for questions and comments.
Thank you for the presentation. I guess I have a rather silly question. What do you mean by philosophizing? Because I think if you answer that, then some of the problems that seem to plague philosophizing in African languages might otherwise disappear. For example, for Wiredu, it seems to me that his project is not so much about writing in African languages as it is thinking in African languages. And so when you already consider thinking, philosophizing, so Wiredu would say that, well, thinking in African language and investing about the concept of an unmovable mover makes sense in your language, and if it doesn't, then think further to find out why. So the first instant you think in your language, and then the second instant where you try to find out why the concept doesn't make sense, you can either think it in your language, or, and Redo would probably favor the second part, you think it in another language, which is probably English or French or whatever, and then you publish your results in whatever language you choose. So you could do it in English, French, or in your native language. But what you've done already is you have philosophized successfully, according to Redo, in an African language. And so it seems to me the problem then is not so much philosophizing in African languages, it is writing in African languages and how that is affected by problems that have little to do with philosophy as they do with world economy.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. How to differentiate between philosophizing, thinking, and what means publishing then, or writing as also a practice. I mean, philosophizing is a term which includes, of course, thinking, yeah, as a practice, but can also include writing as a media of expression then, but also maybe other practices, yeah. We are used to reading and writing in our tradition mainly, but there might be also other practices. So what do I mean by philosophizing? Also, my understanding of philosophy, which is an abstract noun, but which is represented actually in a certain activity, namely this kind of philosophizing. Philosophizing or philosophy for me is characterized by a movement of thought, for example, which tries to put into question what is taken as the usual, yeah, as the norms, and tries to open new perspectives or critique certain points, try to change perspectives, open new visions, etc. So this is a very crucial for me, very crucial for what I see as philosophizing. Now, about thinking and writing, yeah, I mean, here we have a big difference, and that's why I introduced these two positions from the bigger discourse on philosophizing in African languages. Here we have two different positions, namely Ngugi on the one side, for whom thinking in African languages is anyway needed, or many people just do it, but they don't have access to the writing of the intellectuals who maybe, and this is, I think, also part of his critique, started to think already in European languages and do not just only write in European languages, but also started to think in European languages, but are anyway, through the education, depending on this epistemological frame of the language and also of the educational system. And so far, for him, it is also very important to write in African languages. And here, yeah, there's a big difference to Wiredu, who says, yeah, let's think in African languages, but the media of expression might be, can be, or even should be another one, because one of his main arguments is, yeah, we are so multilingual here in Africa. If I want other people to share, or if I want to share my ideas with other people, I even have to write in another language, namely in English, for example, so that I can have feedback and exchange, etc. Naja, also, in my opinion, the more radical but also consequent way is then also to write in African languages, to make your thoughts also accessible for those who might not be able from your compatriots who might not be able to read English or French or whatever. And also, and I think this is also a very important argument by Ngugi, also to keep African languages alive, all right? Because if you don't use it also on the level of producing science, literature, or philosophy or art, then it is impoverished. Yeah, African languages. And so far, in my opinion, it's a more consequent step, but I also try to show all the challenges, all the problems which are coming along or which are accompanied by going such a radical step. What I don't agree, and I think here is his position really so radical, is to say that only in African languages, philosophy done only in African languages is proper African philosophy. Yeah? I think this is really very radical, because also Viredu, as you know, he says or he has the opinion that all languages can be translated into each other. Yeah? They are commensurable, and insofar, of course, one can also express his, her, whatever thought in other languages and make it understandable in other languages. And only philosophizing in African languages, I think, is too much limited, or also in face of the fact that for quite a number of at least the people of the African elites, intellectual elites, political elites or so, it became the mother tongue because they don't learn African languages anymore. And so far it is also an exclusive point. So I don't know if you are satisfied with my answer, but okay.
But we can proceed maybe
Yes.
tomorrow.
Yes.
This question. Other comments or questions?
Since I have the mic, perhaps I can talk from here. Thank you very much, Anke, for this overview, also on this lecture series and your suggestions. So I have a comment and a question. The comment is I think the relationship between thought and the language. We find also, for example, in European language, for example, Wittgenstein, his difficulty to write in English. He writes about that he has some text in English, and he says that for me is a very unnatural way. And I think there is the question of mother tongue, as you said, very important, in which language there is this immediate relation to the thought. And I think in that case, for example, among the African philosophers, we have some cases of people who write or speak French or English so immediately that this relation is not problematic. And I think that is very important, that aspect. But my question, as you were talking, I was asking myself, especially when you mentioned Viredu, that if a philosophical conversation in, for example, Akan is taking place on Plato, translation of Plato in Akan, and the conversation is taking place in Akan on Plato, is it, according to Viredu, the closer to the African thought with regard to the language, or if the conversation is taking place in English, but about the Akan, for example, some Akan concepts, for example, reflection in English about that Akan concepts, for example. It was, to me, I have the natural tendency to say that the second one is rather African, is closer to the African philosophy, but paradoxically, the conversation is taking place in English. And so, for me, I'm thinking aloud and I want to have your reaction. For me, is very ambivalent. That because when we insist upon the writing and for example, in an African language, it can be a translation of for example, classical European text, and the fact of writing, talking about that. The question is how far is it really African philosophizing? If only the language is determining here. Or, for example, in the second case, we are, for example, as we had after some talks, for example, talking in English as we had the exchanges about the concepts from, for example, Ethiopian languages, Ge'ez, or, for example, Akan language. For me, is an ambivalence that I have actually struggling with, and I wanted to share with you and have your reaction. Yeah.
Okay, I'm afraid I cannot answer your question. I'm also not quite sure what we Redo would, which position we Redo would take into, concerning also your examples. Maybe he would answer that both examples which you gave, I mean, to talk about Plato's apology in, or to discuss Plato's apology in Akan Twi, and discussing Akan philosophy in English is the same level. It's the same level of distance to the original text, which was in the one case written in Greek, and in the other case then maybe written in Akan. But actually this reflects what we are doing anyway all the time here in philosophy. I mean, who is still able to read Plato's Apology in Greek? So the big discourse about all the ancient Greek philosophers is done nowadays in English, French, German, without having real, direct access to these writings, but relying on translations. Or Rolf is always pointing to Kant, who is now discussed in English by many philosophers who just know, or mainly know English, but don't know German. They don't read Kant's critique anymore in German. So, I mean, we have it in all levels, actually, of our work, this being dependent on translations, or having discourses on philosophical theories, categories, which were invented by philosophers in other languages than the one where it is discussed now. So this is a very common practice, I think. As I said at the beginning of my talk, maybe the situation in Africa concerning the language issue is not as relaxed as it is maybe in other areas or regions of the world, because language is such a hot topic because of the instrumentalization of language during colonialism. Insofar, all these issues which are discussed here now have such a very eminent relevance, and have also a political content, so that I think also these translation issues, or also this issue in which language we should think or discuss Akan philosophy, is not so innocent anymore. And this might be the difference, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks for the talk, Anke, and for the whole series of lectures. So something that I find I sometimes encounter when trying to teach similar topics to this, both the sort of conceptual decolonization stuff and some of the broader questions about sort of, what counts as African philosophy, who counts as an African philosopher, is students are often very interested in sort of like, finding out what counts as really African philosophy and what's not really African philosophy, but is something that sort of suspiciously looks like it. And one way of drawing that is the way that you suggested, or the way that Ngugi would, broadly between indigenous languages, philosophizing in indigenous languages, and philosophizing in non-indigenous languages, with the suggestion being that the latter is somehow kind of inauthentic. And I wanted to kind of think about two ways of kind of muddying the waters there, or making it a little bit more complicated. One of which would be something that you'd kind of suggested when you were saying that obviously Arabic doesn't take its source from Africa, it's a non-indigenous language to the continent, but over 1,500 years of fairly tight intermingling and hybridization, it probably should count as one now. the European languages have a much shorter history on the continent, but for many African writers and philosophers, it's very much their language. And you've got arguments from obviously one side of the Nairobi debate that you'd mentioned, and from people like Bashir Jan, that French would be his language in a comparative way, a medium of philosophy that he would endorse doing. And then on the other hand, the one thing you hadn't sort of touched on with Wiredu is the suggestion that in conceptual decolonization, he talks about it sometimes as colonization induces a kind of involuntary intermingling of categories, right? Colonized peoples didn't get to choose which English words were used to describe particular kinds of experience, and that there are some cases where we want to separate out that conceptual baggage, right? Where where missionaries, for example, have redescribed your religion as animistic, or has redescribed, religion as worshipping a fetish or something like that, something that you want to reject. Here's a case where we separate out the indigenous terms of the language that are used to describe conceptual reality. Whereas there are other terms and ways of describing things from English or French or whatever else that the African philosopher might want to hold on to. Maybe the language of, particle physics or germ theory or something like that seems of like practical utility. And it's really interesting that you mentioned Diop as well, as somebody who's actually like, no, we can do that in African languages as well. And so I guess Wiredu offers a way forwards that involves continuing to philosophize in English, also for the political reasons you put up there before. I hadn't seen that one about the necessity of being able to communicate, but of being able to do African philosophy in English, but in a critical way that relies on the conceptual tools given by particular African languages, and in a way that we could imagine a sort of 16th century scholar in Timbuktu doing with his Ajami, Arabic, Wolof, for example, philosophical vocabulary. So I wanted to know whether what you thought about that general approach to doing philosophy. I would say, primarily it's being done in a non-native language, but with the resources of indigenous languages, and what you thought about how that related to what you said about the future for doing African philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, I don't want to defend purity here. Because, of course, also in our German tradition, we have ages, centuries, where there was kind of interminglement of languages in philosophical works. If we think, for example, of the the works of Heumann, if you read from beginning of 18th century, 1728, for example, a text where German, Latin, Greek, and French is in the text just intermingled. Yeah, so we have these examples also here we can show examples from our own history. So Ajami literature is, of course, a very good example. And also what Wiredu is doing, or others who are following now Wiredu's way to do philosophy in Africa, to take concepts from African languages and use it for their work. Also Wiredu also was talking about this principle of consensus democracy, where he's also referring to Akan traditions, etc. It's a legitimate way to do philosophy. I don't want to devalue it. But what I wanted to show, and where I try to argue for on behalf of Ngugi, is that it is still also important to write in African languages. Also to, and if it is only for the purpose of public philosophy, which is, but I think, so important. Also to use the tools and means of philosophy or make them accessible for a wider audience outside the academy. And here we need, I think, as much as it is needed to continue to write in German, Yeah, not only for the academic discourse, which is also interesting, but also to reach people, yeah, the people outside the academy here in Germany. I think it is also important to do this in African languages. And I think what is shown clearly in linguistic research is that languages like Swahili, who have such a big reach, or Hausa, yeah, or Amharic, for example. These are good examples where it is worth just doing it, yeah, because you can reach a lot of people. Yeah, maybe not in every small language, yeah, but at least in these languages, and this could also, of course, contribute to develop philosophizing in this language, also maybe on an useful also for the academies. Then. So why, for example, should one not write or not be able to write a PhD in an African language? It's rarely done. You report it in Amharic. I think there are cases, right? I think in Tanzania there are some examples in Swahili, but that's it, I think. There's almost no further examples of doing this, but I think it would be worth doing it. And here I'm again arguing for, let's give up this either or. Yeah? Let's try to think both and. So both is possible, both is valid, both can have an importance in the discourses for wider society, for the academic discourses. Let's do both. This is what I wanted to say, I think.
I have a question concerning this. In my contribution, I argued that we should really radically disconnect language and nationality and geography. Languages as such are rich in itself, and not because they are African, Indian, or some languages from somewhere, because there is a language community which is using this language. And I think in the discussion now we are always connecting languages with African language, and then a geographical category comes in. But if we just only stress the value of the different languages as tools of philosophizing, maybe from Africa, but also from other parts of the world, and I can imagine that maybe a so-called philosopher in Africa learn some Sanskrit or starts to learn Indonesian language. And then there is a new crossing. And my main argument would be that we should take the plurality of languages more serious in that sense, that all people who do, at least in a professional way, philosophy should learn at least 2 languages which come from 2 totally different language families. And this would make the point or the importance of the difference of the languages more visible for the act of philosophizing itself, and radically disconnected from the geographical point of view. And that would be, how do you think about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think it's also a very important question and a nice utopia. What I wanted to underline here in my talk, or what I wanted to ask or figure out, is why is it so difficult to really philosophize in African languages? I wanted to figure out the practical problems. Yeah, because we can have these nice utopias, but if it is still so difficult to philosophize in your own mother tongue, yeah, then, learning Chinese, what, by the way, some African philosophers are doing already, they are studying in China, there are some people doing it already, is also nice, but doesn't help to enrich African languages, you know. So, there's an urgent need, there's a language policy which also has to be considered, and which is very specific, I think, in the African context, and where still quite a number of problems, I think, have to be solved. And maybe one has to go step by step. Yeah, maybe first solve these internal problems. And by the way, it is not just national problems, because I mean, Swahili or Hausa are languages used transnational in big parts of Africa. So, I mean, yeah, this is my answer. So let's do it step by step. Let's reflect about also the political challenges here, or the problems, how to realize philosophizing in African languages. And yeah, that it can be enriched by other languages too. Yeah, okay. I'm not against this, but I think other problems have to be solved too. Yeah. Time is up, yeah.
I think it is. Okay, yeah, perfect. So, thank you very much again.
Thank you.
For your contribution and for all the questions and comments. And I think now we are at the end of the lecture series. Thanks again to you and to Monika Romer, who organized this, and thank you for attending the lecture. Some of you came quite often, and hoping to see you again maybe in the next semester in a different context. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.